Part 142 words on February 27th, 1943. A sergeant named Thomas Breedlove opened his diary somewhere in the Algerian mountains and wrote 9 sentences. He was 23 years old, from Macon, Georgia. He had survived the landing in North Africa and 3 months of desert campaigning. He was not a man given to complaint. He wrote, "Don't know where the rest of the company is. Don't know where battalion is. Heard the Germans hit our artillery and got everything. We're walking west. Nobody's talking much. Can't shake the feeling we just got beat. Not lost. Beat." That last word is the one that matters. Not lost. Beat. The distinction between those two words is the difference between an army that has suffered a setback and an army that has decided something fundamental about itself. An army that believes it has been beaten sometimes becomes an army that cannot stop believing it. That was the thing Dwight Eisenhower was most afraid of in the winter of 1943. Not the German panzers. The word beat. 4 days before Breedlove wrote those 9 sentences, on February 23rd, 1943, Erwin Rommel stood before his staff in a briefing room somewhere in western Tunisia and delivered a verdict. 42 words, he said. "The Americans are not soldiers yet. They are well-equipped tourists who do not know what they are doing. Give me 48 hours and I will destroy what remains of their army in Africa." 42 words. The confidence of a man who had just watched American tanks burn by the hundreds. American boys run by the thousands. American commanders collapse under pressure they had never been trained to survive. The verdict was not wrong. It was almost wrong in exactly the right way. Rommel was 51 years old. He had spent a decade fighting wars that most of his enemies didn't understand were wars yet. He had driven the British Empire to the edge of collapse across 2,000 miles of North African sand. He read battlefields the way a mechanic reads an engine, not from descriptions, but from the sounds it makes under load. He was also, in February of 1943, physically broken. A digestive illness had been grinding him down for months. He knew, with the cold arithmetic that had replaced most of what passes for optimism in a senior German commander by 1943, that the Afrika Korps was going to lose North Africa. He had told Hitler. Hitler had not listened. What Rommel was doing at Kasserine Pass was not winning the war. He was making a statement before the end. He was ensuring that the record would show what American forces looked like before they learned what they were doing. And the record he created was devastating. In 6 days of fighting through the mountain passes of western Tunisia, the U.S. Second Corps lost 6,500 men killed, wounded, or captured. Nearly 200 tanks were destroyed. 183 artillery pieces were abandoned in the sand. An entire armored division, the 1st Armored, was functionally wrecked. Supply depots were overrun. Headquarters staff were caught in open trucks, fleeing forward positions as German armor rolled through. The numbers are not the worst part. The worst part is what happened when the panzers stopped. Rommel's columns halted not because American resistance stopped them, but because his own supply lines were overextended. British forces were pressing from the north. When the shooting slowed, the men of Second Corps were not regrouping. They were drifting, moving in small packs through the Algerian mountains, uncertain of their own unit boundaries, uncertain of their officers, uncertain of whether anyone was coming to retrieve them, or whether the whole theater had simply collapsed while they weren't looking. That was the landscape Dwight Eisenhower was looking at from Algiers. He was 52 years old. He did not panic. Panic is not a thing that Eisenhower did. What he did instead was think, and what he thought was this: there is one man who might be able to reverse this, and I have been avoiding using him for reasons that now seem considerably less important than they did 3 weeks ago. The man had a reputation for causing trouble. He had slapped a soldier at a hospital in Sicily. He had made speeches that required Eisenhower to write letters of apology to people he had never met. He was difficult. He was excessive. He was, by the measured professional assessment of nearly everyone who had served alongside him, the most effective offensive commander in the United States Army. His name was George S. Patton. But before we get to what Patton did, we need to understand what created the conditions that made Kasserine possible. Because the defeat was not primarily about Rommel. The defeat was about a bunker. Lloyd Fredendall was 59 years old. He was a major general and the commanding officer of the U.S. Second Corps. He had served his country for decades. He had risen through the ranks on the strength of peacetime evaluations that measured everything except the one thing that was about to be tested. In 2 months of fighting in Tunisia, Fredendall had not visited the front lines. Not once. His command post was a bunker carved out of the rock in a ravine near Tepedessa, 2 miles behind the fighting, built by engineer troops who spent weeks on its construction while the men at the front were short of everything. His orders traveled by radio to units he had never seen, fighting over ground he had never walked. When the attack came, the gap between the orders being issued and the reality of what was happening in the passes was not the kind of gap that can be closed by better communications or more artillery. It was the kind of gap that only exists when the man giving the orders has no personal knowledge of the terrain his orders apply to. The men who broke at Kasserine were not cowards. Most of them had been in the field for months and had learned things about desert warfare that no training manual covered. They broke because no one in their chain of command had come to see what they were actually facing. That was the system failure. That was the thing that Rommel's 42 words were actually describing. Even if Rommel himself didn't know it, he was right about the result. He was wrong about the cause. He thought the problem was the soldiers. The problem was the bunker. Eisenhower knew this when he picked up the phone. He knew what the problem was, and he knew what the solution looked like. And he knew the solution was going to cause him a different kind of headache. Headache of managing George Patton was a manageable headache. The army drifting west through the mountains of Algeria was not manageable without him. On March 6th, 1943, the solution arrived. Part 2, 10 days. Jeep did not arrive first. The motorcycles arrived first. Then the armored scout cars. Then the flags, snapping in the cold Tunisian wind. Then the sirens. Then, at the center of all of it, a vehicle containing a man who wore his helmet liner lacquered to a shine and carried twin revolvers with ivory grips on his hips and moved through a crowd the way a current moves through water, without asking permission and without slowing down. George Patton was 57 years old. He had the bearing of a man who had been waiting for this particular morning since he was 10 years old. Within 90 minutes of his arrival at Second Corps headquarters, he had relieved 2 officers. He had issued a general order requiring every man in the Corps to wear his helmet and his necktie at all times, in the desert, in combat, and at mess. He had delivered a briefing to his division commanders that one witness later described as the most frightening speech he had ever heard a general give. The essence of it was this: they hit us hard. They will hit us again. And we are going to hit them first, faster, and from a direction they are not expecting. Now, the helmet order. It has been misunderstood for 80 years as theater, as the performance of a general who wanted his men to fear him. It was not theater. It was philosophy. Patton believed, from everything he had read and everything he had witnessed in a career that stretched back to the First World War, that the external expression of discipline and the internal capacity for discipline are not 2 different things. They are the same thing, measured at different scales. A man who will not discipline himself to wear a helmet when no one is watching will not discipline himself to hold a position when the pressure comes. Small capitulations and the large capitulations are connected. Fix the small ones, and you have begun the work on the large ones. Men hated it. They wore their helmets. What happened in the 10 days between March 6th and the opening of the Guettar operation on March 17th was not a transformation. Armies do not transform in 10 days. What happened was something more specific and more useful than transformation. The men of Second Corps began to believe, for reasons they could not entirely articulate, that the person giving them orders had actually been to the places the orders applied to, because Patton had been there. Every morning he drove to the front, not to a command post at a safe distance behind the fighting, to the battalions, to the companies, to the specific pieces of ground where the officers and men who had retreated across the Algerian mountains were still trying to understand what had happened to them. He asked questions and he listened to the answers. He fired the ones who had already given up inside. He found the ones who hadn't, and he told them, in the direct and profane register that was his natural language, that he expected something from them. He ate with enlisted men. He drove through areas under artillery fire because he needed to see the ground himself. He gave every senior officer who reported to him the same fundamental instruction: do not tell me what you cannot do. Tell me what you are going to do instead. And on March 9th, 1943, 3 days after Patton assumed command, Erwin Rommel boarded an aircraft at a Tunisian airfield and flew to Germany. Hitler had recalled him. The official explanation was health. The actual explanation was that Hitler could not afford to have his most famous general present when North Africa fell. Rommel was a propaganda asset. The Reich could not allow a propaganda asset to be photographed surrendering. So he was removed quietly before the final chapter was written. He never came back. He never commanded in North Africa again. The man Patton would actually fight was not Rommel. It was General Friedrich von Broich, who commanded the German 10th Panzer Division, who was capable and experienced, and who had formed his opinion of American fighting ability entirely from the evidence available at Kasserine Pass. Von Broich received the intelligence assessment that American forces were moving toward Guettar and said to his staff, with the measured confidence of a professional acting on accurate prior experience, they are coming after their embarrassment at Kasserine. Let them come. They will find the same result they always find when they try to fight Germans. He was not a stupid man. He was making a rational decision. The problem was that the prior experience was about to become obsolete. March 17th, 1943, 3 in the morning. The foothills south of Guettar. 1st Ranger Battalion moved in darkness. No flashlights. No talking above a whisper. Boots wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound against the stone. Colonel William Darby, 31 years old, who had trained every one of these men personally and knew each of them by name, moved at the head of the column and did not look at his map. He had memorized the map. What he was watching instead was the shape of the ridgeline against the stars. Behind the Rangers came Company G of the 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division. 171 men stretched into a single file that disappeared into the dark. Captain James Forsyth moved at the center of the column. He was 27 years old, from Scranton, Pennsylvania. He was not a West Point graduate. He had not written tactical papers. What he was, by every account of the men who served under him, was a reader, not of books, of ground. He could look at terrain at a ridgeline, at the angle of a shadow at 6 in the morning, and tell you where the enemy would be before you could see them. That skill is not mystical, it is mathematical. It's exactly the kind of battlefield intelligence that Patton's philosophy was designed to produce and reward. Inside Forsyth's helmet liner, pressed against the inner surface, was a photograph, his wife. The crease down the center of it came from where his fingers touched it before every operation. 2 children he had not seen in 14 months. At 4:17, the column reached the Wadi. The French survey maps, drawn before the war, showed a dry riverbed that was negligible, passable, almost flat. The maps were wrong. What lay across the floor of the valley was a ditch 40 meters wide and 3 meters deep, with walls of crumbling shale that a man could slide down and could not climb back up with a full combat load and a rifle. A jeep could not cross it. A regimental assault with resupply vehicles and artillery could not cross it. Nobody in Patton's headquarters knew this. The maps had not shown it. Forsyth went forward personally. He walked the lip of the wadi for 200 meters in each direction. No crossing point, no ford. He called for the radio. His operator, Private First Class Agustin Delgado, 20 years old from Albuquerque, New Mexico, was already working it. Working it the way you work a radio when you already know the answer you're getting is bad. At 4:43, Forsyth got through to battalion. He reported the obstacle. He asked for engineering support or a new route. The response from Lieutenant Colonel Ben Sternberg took 11 minutes. Combat time, that is not 11 minutes. It is a separate lifetime. New orders from division. The Rangers have secured the ridgeline. Continue the assault. Mission timeline cannot slip. Move your company through the obstacle by foot. Forsyth read the order twice. Then he made the decision that a less competent officer might have refused, and a more experienced one might have made faster. He obeyed it, because the Rangers were already on the high ground. Because every minute that passed without infantry below them was a minute in which the Germans could counterattack the ridge. Because the mission had a logic that did not stop being true because the ground had changed. He ordered Company G into the wadi. It took 40 minutes to get 171 men across. 40 minutes of slipping on shale, of lifting equipment hand-to-hand over crumbling walls, of cursing in whispers, and praying that the German pickets above the pass were not mourning people. 3 men twisted ankles. 1 broke his wrist. They came out the other side at 5:41, 4 minutes before first light, and immediately ran into the thing that no one in Allied headquarters had prepared for. The forward screen that von Broich had ordered reinforced the previous day was not a platoon. It was not a company. It was 2 full companies of Panzer Grenadiers, veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had learned to dig fast and shoot faster, plus 4 PaK-40 anti-tank guns positioned to cover every obvious approach to the pass. They had been there since midnight. They were awake. They had been waiting. Ambush opened at 5:47 from 3 directions simultaneously. No warning, no preliminary fire. Just the sudden convergence of machine gun fire from the left, rifle fire from the front, and the hammer crack of an anti-tank gun to the right. Firing at a target that Forsyth realized in the first half-second of comprehension was not a tank. The gun was firing at his men. Because the German intelligence had predicted armor with this column. Because the wadi had sent the armor somewhere else. The ambush had been designed for a column with tanks. The tanks hadn't appeared. The PaK-40 crews fired at what they could see. Private Henry Abramowitz, 22 years old, from the Bronx, New York, the best poker player in Company G, was dead before he hit the ground. Corporal Mark Tisdall, 24, from Birmingham, Alabama, who had survived Kasserine Pass by hiding under a dead mule for 6 hours and had never told anyone about it, made it 4 steps toward cover before the machine gun on the left found him. In the first 90 seconds, Company G lost 11 men. Forsyth hit the ground and started moving. Not backward, not forward, sideways. He was looking for the shape of the fire, where it concentrated, where it thinned, where the enemy gunners were taking their cues from each other. Men who plan an ambush always have a kill zone, and the edge of a kill zone, if you can reach it fast enough, is survivable. He got 12 men into a shallow depression at the base of the ridge. 12 men. 3 rifles with full magazines, 1 Browning automatic rifle, 2 grenades. At 6:01, the radio reached battalion. Forsyth reported the ambush. He counted 15 confirmed dead. He requested artillery. The response made his stomach drop. Cannot confirm artillery support. 32nd FA Battalion engaged on the northern flank. Air support unavailable. Weather closing in. Hold position. Reinforce your left. He looked at Delgado. Delgado was looking at the radio like it had spoken in a language neither of them had ever heard. Hold position. With 12 men in a hole, no artillery, no air support, no vehicles that had made it across the wadi, and no reinforcements that could reach them without crossing the same ground the ambush was covering. Hold position meant die slower. Forsyth set down the handset and looked at the ridge above him. The Rangers were up there somewhere, beyond German rifle range, beyond the awareness, apparently, of any headquarters currently coordinating American forces in this valley. 46 men of Company G had made it into or near the depression. 23 more were pinned across the valley floor. 12 were not moving. 600 meters to the north, in a stone farmhouse being used as a command post, Hauptmann Werner Kessler, 31 years old, was already composing in his mind the message he would send to von Broich. Americans attacked as expected. Attack repulsed. Light casualties. Americans retreating toward original positions. He did not send it yet. He was waiting for the Americans to break. They did not break. That was the moment. Not heroism. Not courage. The simple, operationally inconvenient fact Company G did not run when the first crack appeared in Kessler's confidence. 6:20. Forsyth had perhaps 30 minutes before the Germans decided to encircle what was left of his company. He could feel the logic of it. He would have done the same. He had 46 men, the Germans numbered, based on the volume of fire and the pattern of the machine gun sweeps, somewhere between 200 and 280. Math was not good. The math was, in fact, the math that headquarters uses to justify the phrase, hold position, when it means you are probably going to die, and we cannot help you. Patton had a name for what happened to officers who looked at that math and accepted it. He called it the paralysis of the obvious. In his field notes, distributed to every officer in Second Corps after he assumed command, Patton had written a sentence that Forsyth had read 4 times. A sentence that sounded like a general's boast until the moment you needed it, at which point it became operational doctrine. The enemy has a plan. That plan has a shape. The shape has a weakness. The weakness is always in the one direction the enemy is most certain you will not go. Forsyth looked at the ground, not at the Germans. He had looked at the Germans long enough. To his left, the ridge, steep, covered by German observation. To his right, the valley floor, flat open, covered by the PaK-40 guns. Directly ahead, the main German position, dug in and waiting. Behind him, the wadi. 40 minutes of exposure to cross. None of those were the answer. The answer was something he had seen at 4:30, crossing the wadi and registered as a footnote. On the eastern wall, roughly 300 meters south of where the company had crossed, a section of shale had collapsed inward. A natural ramp, partially hidden from above by an overhang of harder rock. He had cataloged it unconsciously as an alternate extraction route. It was not an extraction route. It was a flanking route. German ambush had been designed for a west-to-east attack. Every gun was pointing west. Every observer was watching west. The 300 meters of valley floor between his current position and that ramp would be visible for approximately 40 seconds to one machine gun position on the ridge before a fold in the ground cut the sight line. 40 seconds. But there was the farmhouse problem. The same farmhouse that Kessler was using as his command post was almost certainly occupied by a Tunisian family that had not left. The laundry on the line during the approach, the small garden along the south wall, the 2 goat pens in the back. Families often did not leave. The Germans occupied your house, and you stayed in the back room, because leaving meant walking into a battlefield, and that was worse. If Forsyth's flanking movement worked, if he could get his men around the German left and come up behind the farmhouse from the one direction nobody in the German position was watching, the farmhouse became the problem. Assault on a command post with a family inside. He made the decision in under 60 seconds. He sent Sergeant First Class Luis Montoya forward. Montoya was 34 years old, a career soldier from El Paso, Texas, the oldest man in the company, and the one who spoke enough Arabic to ask basic questions. His assignment was not to fight. His assignment was to move along the wadi bank, reach the south wall of the farmhouse, find the civilians, and get them moving before the assault hit. Montoya went, without hesitation, into the ground between two armed forces with no protection except the fact that neither side was watching it yet. If you have served in combat, you know exactly what Montoya volunteered for. You know what it costs a man to leave a fighting position and walk alone into open ground. 6:41. Forsyth divided his remaining 46 men into 4 elements. 8 men stayed in the depression and kept firing, not to advance, to keep the German observers watching west. Their job was noise. Their job was to be exactly what the Germans expected. He gave Sergeant First Class Albert Drummond command of those 8 men with 6 words. Make it sound like 40 men. Drummond looked at him. Yes, sir. 20 men would move south along the wadi bank, concealed by the walls, toward the ramp. 10 men would follow Forsyth directly. 8 men would hold the far right flank as a blocking force. The flankers entered the wadi at 6:44. Moving through a wadi under fire is not like moving through a trench. A trench is linear. A wadi bends. It narrows. It widens into pools of dried mud that grip your boots like wet concrete. The men moved bent double, rifles held horizontal to keep the barrels from scraping stone. No talking. Only the flat crack of Drummond's men behind them, maintaining their fiction of a much larger force. Forsyth reached the ramp first. He looked up. The overhang was intact. The sight line to the Ridge machine gun was blocked. Not fully, but enough. The 40-second window he had calculated from below was closer to 35 seconds from here, because the ramp came up at an angle and they would be moving uphill. He turned to the man directly behind him. Private First Class Raymond Kowalczyk was 21 years old, from Detroit, Michigan. He had never mentioned to anyone in Company G that he had applied to the Marine Corps and been rejected for being 2 pounds underweight. He had walked out of the recruiting office and joined the Army the same afternoon. Forsyth said, "When we clear the top, you go left. Don't stop." Kowalczyk nodded. They went up. Below them and behind them in the depression, 8 men with 3 rifles and 1 BR were cycling fire the way Drummond had been trained to cycle fire. Burst from left, burst from right. BR in the middle, 1 grenade at maximum range, then the cycle again. The German machine gun on the ridge rotated 5 degrees west. Not much, but 5 degrees was a corridor. Company G made it up the ramp, and then everything went wrong again. Between the top of the ramp and the farmhouse, where the map showed 30 meters of open field, there was a secondary fighting position. 4 men, an MG-42 crew, dug into a scrape that was invisible from every direction except the one Forsyth was now approaching from. The MG-42 crew saw Company G at the same moment Company G saw the MG-42 crew. 3 seconds of mutual recognition, the specific terrifying pause before close violence that every veteran of close combat describes the same way, regardless of theater or era or decade. The pause where both sides understand what is about to happen, and the only question is who decides first. Kowalczyk decided first. He was not a hero in the cinematic sense. He was a 21-year-old boy from Detroit who was 2 seconds ahead of his own fear and moved before the fear could catch up to him. He went left and forward simultaneously, not toward cover, toward the gun crew. The rounds the MG-42 fired in the next 3 seconds went above and to the left of the position he had just been standing in. Forsyth's element cleared the fighting position in 40 seconds. He did not describe those 40 seconds in his after-action report. There are things that happen in 40 seconds of close combat that require a different grammar than official documentation permits. 6:58, the MG-42 was silent. The farmhouse was 30 meters ahead. Montoya was not visible anywhere. For 12 seconds, Forsyth did not know if Montoya had reached the civilians or if Montoya was dead. Then the door on the south wall opened. A woman, 40 years old, maybe 50, Tunisian, in a gray jalaba, walked out with 2 children and a goat, moving south with the specific, practiced calm of someone who has been told exactly where to go and is going there. Behind her came Montoya, walking backward, rifle up, watching the door. Civilians were out. Forsyth hit the farmhouse from 2 directions at 7. 2. Hauptmann Kessler had received no warning. Not because his men failed to fight, but because the direction of the attack was, in the precise language of tactical analysis, impossible. The American unit that had been pinned in a depression west of the pass was attacking from the south, from behind the German left flank, from the one direction the entire engagement had been designed to make unreachable. Kessler's radio call to von Broich went out at 7:11. Americans have flanked position 7. South approach. Unclear how. Request immediate reinforcement. Request artillery on our own former position. Fire on the farmhouse. Americans are there. Von Broich's response took 4 minutes. By then it was academic. Forsyth had not stopped at the farmhouse. He understood from everything Patton had drilled into every officer in 2nd Corps in the 10 days between his arrival and this morning, that tactical momentum is a physical phenomenon. It dissipates the moment you stop to consolidate what you have gained rather than drive toward what you need next. Patton had put it simply in his field notes. An army is a river. Rivers don't pause at the first ford. They find the sea. 7:14. Forsyth found the German platoon command post for the forward blocking position, the one coordinating the entire ambush. He had 16 men who were fully combat effective. 2 more who were moving on adrenaline and leg wounds they had not yet allowed themselves to feel. 1 magazine and a half for his Thompson submachine gun. 7:16, his men cut the field telephone lines running to every gun position in the forward screen. The forward screen went deaf. The pack 40 guns stopped receiving direction. Machine Gun on the ridge lost its forward observers. Drummond's 8 men in the depression, still holding their fiction of 40 men for 37 minutes, noticed the change in fire almost immediately. They did not wait for orders. They stood up and walked forward. Not charged, walked. Because the fire had stopped and the ground was theirs. 7:19, Private Delgado finally reached battalion on the radio. He relayed the situation in a voice that witnesses described as completely flat and completely calm. Company G is through the pass. Position is ours. We need medics, and we need them now. Sir, we need medics right now. By 8:0 on March 17th, 1,943, the pass at El Guettar had fallen completely. Company G went into the pass with 171 men. 137 came out the far side. Part 3, the document and the ridge. At von Broich's headquarters, between 7:11 and 7:30 that morning, the radio reports had been arriving in a sequence that a German staff officer would later describe to Allied historians as each one more confusing than the last. Americans north of position 7. Americans south of position 7. Position 7. Fallen. Position 8 not answering. Artillery firing on coordinates that had already changed 3 times. General said nothing for several minutes. Then he said, "They did not do what we thought they would do." I had never heard him say that before about any enemy. 6 days later, on March 23rd, 1,943, the German 10th Panzer Division launched a full-scale counterattack on the El Guettar position. 50 tanks. The expectation, built on every piece of evidence available to German intelligence, was that the Americans would break as they had at Kasserine. They did not break. The 1st Infantry Division and the 1st Ranger Battalion held. The 10th Panzer lost 30 tanks and retreated. It would be recorded as the first American ground victory against the German military in the Second World War. Not a decisive breakthrough, not a campaign-winning stroke, a line that held when the calculations said it wouldn't. That distinction mattered enormously. When Allied forces overran the German command post in the final days of the Tunisian campaign, campaign in May of 1943, they captured the headquarters files intact. What those files contained was not operational intelligence in the conventional sense. What they contained was something more unusual, a fundamental revision in German thinking about the American military. Von Broek, interrogated by Allied officers after his capture on May 12th, 1943, said something that entered the Allied Tactical and Strategic Assessments Report for the North Africa Theater, dated June 1943. He said, "At El Guettar, I received my first true understanding of what General Patton had done with the American Second Corps. They did not fight as we expected. They fought as we would have fought, reading the ground, ignoring what should have been impossible, moving when everything said to stop. That is not something you train in 6 months. That is something a commander either creates in his men or does not. Patton had created it." The same file contained a field report from Hauptmann Werner Kessler, written 2 weeks after the engagement, in which he described the flanking movement of Company G with the clinical respect that German military writing reserves for operations that genuinely surprised it. The Americans moved through terrain we had determined to be impassable. They did not seek the obvious approach. They found the one angle our position did not cover, and they exploited it at the exact moment our fire discipline was most committed to the false threat. This was not luck. This was doctrine applied by men who believed in it. Erwin Rommel never saw these documents. He was in Germany when they were written, physically recovering from the illness that had been breaking him down for months, professionally processing what it meant that Tunisia had fallen and that his analysis had been correct about the campaign's outcome and wrong about the army that would eventually win it. After the Tunisian campaign concluded in Allied victory on May 13th, 1943, Rommel wrote in his personal diary. He wrote, "The Americans I met at Kasserine were not the Americans who held El Guettar. Either they learned very fast or Patton found a way to release what was already in them. I made the mistake of assuming they were what I saw first. I should have known. All armies are what their commanders make them." 42 words to sentence an American army to death. Rather, more words to acknowledge having been wrong. George Patton received the report of the March 17th action at 2nd Corps headquarters that afternoon. His aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Codman, was present. By several accounts, Patton's response was not celebratory. He read the after-action summary. He looked at the casualty list. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said one sentence. "That's what I wanted them to know how to do." Not, "That's what I wanted them to do." That's what I wanted them to know how to do. The distinction is the entire philosophy. Patton's tactical framework, the one he had drilled into 2nd Corps in the 10 days between his arrival and El Guettar, was not about courage. Every army has courage. It was about cognition, the ability to think under fire. To read an obstacle not as a stop sign, but as information about where the enemy is most vulnerable. He had told his officers on March 8th, "Pressure makes diamonds." What I am asking of you is to think like diamonds while the pressure is being applied. Company G, 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, thought like diamonds on the morning of March 17th, 1943. They thought like diamonds while 11 men were dead in the first 90 seconds. They thought like diamonds when the radio said hold position, and Forsyth looked at the terrain and found the ramp. They thought like diamonds when Drummond made 8 men sound like 40, and when Kowalczyk moved before the fear could catch him, and when Montoya walked alone into open ground to get a family and a goat out of the way of what was coming. Their dead were buried at the Allied military cemetery at Gafsa, Tunisia, 40 miles west of El Guettar. The cemetery still exists. If you went there today, you would find 34 American graves from the El Guettar campaign. White marble stones arranged in the precise geometric order that the American military uses to suggest that chaos and sacrifice can be made orderly in retrospect, even when they couldn't be made orderly in the moment. Private Henry Abramowitz, Bronx, New York, age 22, first marble stone in the third row. His family received his personal effects in June of 1943. A wallet, a letter he had written but not mailed, a deck of cards held together with a rubber band. The letter was addressed to his mother. It said, among other things, "I think we're figuring it out over here. Don't worry, there is a ridge above El Guettar that still has no name on most maps. The local people have a name for it. The name translates roughly as the place where the Americans did not leave. They mean it as a fact, not a compliment. But it is both." Captain Forsyth found Sergeant Montoya at the farmhouse after the shooting stopped. The woman and her children had returned. The goat had not gone far. Montoya was sitting against the south wall, boots off, wrapping his right ankle. He had turned it on the Wadi bank in the dark and said nothing about it until there was nothing left to do that required walking on it. Forsyth sat next to him for 3 minutes without saying anything. Then he said, "Good work, Sergeant." Montoya said, "The kids kept the goat quiet. I don't know how." That was the whole conversation. What Rommel said in 42 words on February 23rd, 1943, was that the American army in North Africa was not ready to fight. He was right. He was also watching the last moment it was true. What Patton did after those words was not refute them with speeches. He refuted them by showing up, by driving to the front when the safe choice was to stay behind maps, by holding officers accountable for ground they had not walked, by distributing field notes telling captains that the enemy's strength was always in the direction the enemy was most certain you would not go. And on the morning of March 17th, in a valley in Tunisia, a 27-year-old captain from Scranton, Pennsylvania, read a dry riverbed in the dark and found a ramp that nobody had put on any map and used it to hit a German command post from the one direction the Germans had decided was impossible. Rommel never got his 48 hours. The army he dismissed at Kasserine held a pass at El Guettar, and then they held it again 6 days later when 50 German tanks came to take it back. And then they kept going through Sicily and Italy and France and into Germany, doing the thing that Patton had spent 10 days trying to give them the framework to do, not the courage, the cognition. Rommel destroyed Fredendall's army. Patton built a different one. And the difference between those two armies was not equipment and not training and not any quality that a general can manufacture in 10 days of effort. It was the difference between soldiers who had been led from a distance and soldiers who had been led from the front.